Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
It's my pleasure to introduce you all to Professor David Fargas. He is a professor at UW in the Department of Technical Communication, where he teaches various courses and talks about software assistance and hypertext theory, structural features in expository text, etc., etc. His two current projects are QuickScan, an innovative document format that employs within document summaries, and PowerPoint deck design, and that's what he's here to talk to us about today. I don't know what the content of this talk is any more than you do, so I'm really looking forward to it. David?
Thank you, Mary. Good afternoon, folks. Thanks for coming by to hear the presentation. And I'm Dave Farkas, and I think Mary said everything that needs to be said by way of introduction. Let me show you oh, there it goes. Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. So this sort of explains what I study and what I teach, and I can't resist doing this, which is an alternative version of the same slide. And the difference, in a way, is a little preview of what I'm interested in. If you look at the difference between the two slides, the second slide collapses the logical hierarchy visually. It's the same logic, but it's been visually compressed. So just take a look at this and look at that. And that's like a little preview of some of the things that I'll be talking about today. So the plan for the talk is why PowerPoint is important, why all this matters. Then I'm going to review some of the attacks on PowerPoint. Are people familiar with Edward Tufte and that kind of stuff? Okay, I'll say something about that. Then I'm going to step back a little bit and explain why PowerPoint issues are tricky and hard to get a grasp on. Then I'll look at the mediation problem from my point of view, and then make a few suggestions about how that could be, how we can address the mediation problem, and then finally a few thoughts about research, and then hopefully folks here will have questions and ideas. I hope to learn something from everybody here today. So first of all, here's follow-up information. So there are some publications that I've done on PowerPoint at that web page, and also feel free to follow up with me via email. I like talking about this stuff. This talk that I'm giving today does not exist in print at all. It's something that I'm going to probably write up in the future, but none of the things that I've written about PowerPoint are really on this particular topic. So why all this matters, and I think it matters a lot. PowerPoint does definitely mediate. It does shape the presenter's message. It's wrong to say that PowerPoint is purely neutral, that it's just a purely neutral tool. So it mediates. The question is whether it mediates positively or negatively, or a combination of the two. And the societal influence of PowerPoint, as we all know, is enormous. There's the Microsoft estimate of 30 million PowerPoint presentations per day, and no one knows how, I don't know how that ever was compiled, but there's an awful lot of PowerPoint being done all over the world. So this is not an insignificant issue. I mean, PowerPoint is, the mode of communication, in business and government and education and the military and religious services and family events. It's a very, very pervasive force in our society. Also, PowerPoint has a stronger mediational effect, I would argue, than, say, Microsoft Word, which is something closer to being a neutral tool. I don't think any communication technology is truly neutral, but there are degrees. And it's interesting, Edward Tufte, although he condemns PowerPoint's mediational effect, its cognitive style, Tufte says that Word has no cognitive style. So in Tufte's mind, he doesn't see any mediational effect in Word, although he does see it in PowerPoint. And the reason is that PowerPoint's mediational style is more pronounced than that of Word. Now, if everybody were happy with PowerPoint, there wouldn't be too much of a problem, but that's not the case. There's tons of anecdotal evidence of people being very unhappy with the PowerPoint presentations that they have to listen to. Now, very likely, much of this just has to do with dysfunctional organizations, dysfunctional business meetings, meetings that never had to happen in the first place, meetings that, if they had to happen, didn't actually need PowerPoint, and so forth. But, and also the skills of presenters. You go up on the web and you see all these terrible, terrible decks. So you have lots of people who are probably totally unskilled in all forms of communication, and here they are making decks, so it's not going to be surprising that their decks are going to be bad as well. But all that said, I think there are actually mediational problems in PowerPoint, and by the way, not just PowerPoint, because there's a whole genre of presentation software applications that use the slide metaphor, Lotus Freelance Graphics and Apple's Keynote and so forth. But that whole genre of software applications collectively do, I think, have a mediational problem, and that's what I want to talk about today. So first of all, the faulty arguments about PowerPoint's cognitive style, PowerPoint's way of mediating. And it tends to begin with Peter Norvig, who had put up the PowerPoint Gettysburg Address. Are people familiar with that? It's a pretty famous thing on the web. It got a lot of media attention. And Norvig was obviously tired of a lot of the presentations that he was viewing. So he did this. And this is the auto content wizard. And unsurprisingly, it produces this very bizarre version of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And the auto content wizard argument is a cheap shot. But it's a kind of a metaphor, or it sort of opens the door to a more serious discussion of the problems with PowerPoint. So Ian Parker wrote a thoughtful essay in the New Yorker. So this isn't a scholarly article, but it's an intelligent statement. And he sort of starts with the auto content wizard, and then he moves into the default PowerPoint slide layouts. And he's making a reasonable point. I'll give you just a minute to kind of look at that. PowerPoint, he says, does edit ideas. That having to fit your thinking into the slide layouts does, in fact, have a mediational effect. And from there, there's Edward Tufte, who wrote this notorious booklet, which is now in its second edition. As a matter of fact, Tufte was in town lecturing at the Western, I believe, Monday and Tuesday. Anyone happen to see Edward Tufte early this week? And this is a very extreme, hyperbolic diatribe against PowerPoint. It's kind of humorous. He accuses PowerPoint of being Stalinist. So let's see. There's no bullet list like Stalin's bullet list and so forth. But in a more serious vein, he comes very close to blaming PowerPoint for the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster, which is a more serious accusation. And Tufte has a variety of arguments, and it's not very easy to parse them out because they're kind of confused and intertwinkled. But what I wanted to do is run through them because I'm going to go from the least relevant to the most relevant and just sort of show you the argument and the objections to it. So one thing that Tufte says is that bullet points don't provide enough detail. They underspecify the discourse. And the obvious response here, and it's been made in various places, is that Tufte is forgetting about the fact that PowerPoint slides support a presenter. And since Tufte spent his life as a graphics person, he tends to just see PowerPoint slides as standalone graphics. And you read his booklet, and there isn't much discussion really of the speaker. He really is thinking about the slides. He also makes a very big deal of an article by Shaw, Brown, and Bromley in the Harvard Business Review. Now, Shaw, Brown, and Bromley were really talking about bullet points in transparencies. But Tufte adopts the argument for PowerPoint, and it's a big part of his case that PowerPoint is somehow inherently illogical or invites illogical thinking and so forth. And I just wanted to point out that, in fact, the problem is, and I think it's deceptive scholarship on the part of these folks, that the bullet points that Shaw, Brown, and Bromley use for their example are themselves illogical. What we have here is the effect between the two causes. Do you see that? This resulting in this, but the effect is in the middle. So they're the ones who have been illogical. If you arrange the bullet points this way, where you have a cause and an effect, it's not illogical at all. So the argument is specious, and it's a shame that these people put it into the literature, and then Tufte is sort of exploiting that. Another argument that Tufte makes at length is that PowerPoint does not permit, that the resolution of PowerPoint is such that you cannot convey enough visual information. And the answer simply is that that's not what PowerPoint is for. If you need to have a large graphic, have a handout, or use Excel and let it scroll, or whatever. So the PowerPoint was never intended to display large graphics. Now we're moving toward things a little closer to my concerns. Tufte says that PowerPoint encourages deep hierarchies. That's actually not true. The point that I want to make is that PowerPoint, and this is part of the problem of PowerPoint, encourages shallow hierarchies. It has an upward vector, not a downward vector. Print has the downward vector. PowerPoint has the upward vector. And the difference, though, is that in a print document, if you have a whole lot of headings, you don't see them all together. Maybe in the outline view you do, but you normally don't see them all together. Whereas when you have a PowerPoint hierarchy, because the PowerPoint bullet list items are equivalent to the headings, and then the presenter is like the body text. Does that analogy make sense? The presenter is filling out the bullet points in the way that the body text fills out the headings. You're seeing all these headings together, but PowerPoint does not, in fact, make the hierarchy deeper. And I'll say more about that later on. Tufte says that PowerPoint encourages the hiding of ideas, and this is, one of his examples, because the key fact about the problems with the tiles on the shuttle are kind of hidden at the bottom of that slide. But you can hide information in any medium. We have the old expression, hiding it in the fine print. So there's nothing special about PowerPoint there. Now, finally, there's the rigid structure issue. And PowerPoint does have this rigid structure. And here I think Tufte is making a legitimate point, except his arguments are not very clear. But this is what I want to explore. Before doing that, I think we need to step back and consider just how complicated PowerPoint really is. One issue is the different presentation genres. And a lot of the confusion about PowerPoint comes from people writing about one genre or making assumptions about one genre and then sort of carelessly applying it to all the different genres of presentations. So there are light genres, like a product rollout, and then there are substantive technical genres, like a technical briefing, and lots of other genres as well. Tufte is always thinking about substantive genres. Much of the PowerPoint design community really focuses on very light genres. So if you look at something like Gitesh Bajaj's PowerPoint web magazine, everything is about light, fluffy, marketing-type talks and things without a lot of substantive information. But the key thing is that we have to pay attention to this issue of genre. Also, performance. It's very tempting to see a deck on the web and start making judgments about it. But in normal use, that deck is supporting a presentation. And if you haven't been there, if you haven't witnessed the presentation, there's a huge amount that you don't really know. And to make inferences about the deck is actually very, very risky. So some of the variables of performance style would be how quickly the presenter moves through the slides. Because the potential, let's say, of PowerPoint to interfere, to split the attention of the audience between what's on the screen and the oral gloss on what's on the screen is going to be more severe if the presenter is going fast, less severe if the presenter is going slowly, and so forth. So my point here is that we always have to take into account all the performance variables. And there are the audience issues. There are different audiences, and then even the word audience. You folks are, broadly speaking, a fairly homogeneous audience, relatively similar backgrounds, and yet the individual differences here are very significant, and people listen in different ways, listen for different purposes, and so forth, all of which, again, makes talking about PowerPoint or conducting research about PowerPoint or doing design work for the PowerPoint application quite tricky. So now I want to return to the issue of how PowerPoint mediates, what the PowerPoint cognitive style is, sort of from my own perspective. And the most important thing is that PowerPoint slides are chunked. That's the key to this whole issue, I think. When you think about a print document, you can abstract a print document just a little bit, and it's basically a big, long ribbon of text, because the page boundaries are pretty much insignificant. As a writer or document designer, we have a convention that asks us to worry about widows, not letting little bits of text hang off between pages. But that is a very minor issue. So there really isn't significant chunking in print at all. web pages or any scrolling environment is truly just a ribbon of text. But PowerPoint slides, at least in the standard slide layouts that everybody follows, have the dominant slide title. Then you have the main area in the slide, which is very constrained. And then you have that very distinct boundary to the next slide. And people were talking about PowerPoint earlier. That's all like PowerPoint, right? If you made PowerPoint decks, kind of the same kind of medium. And PowerPoint, in my terminology, is topocentric. And what I mean by that is that although you're moving through a deck, each slide is sort of a little mini presentation. Each slide has that title slide. And in print, the reader's eyes are always moving through the text. In PowerPoint, it's not that way at all. While a particular slide is being displayed, the text persists and sort of establishes the context or anchors what the bullet points say and what the presenter is saying. So that's a huge difference, and it's really the most fundamental characteristic of PowerPoint as a medium. And this is a good thing in many ways, because whatever the presenter is talking about at that moment is zoomed up to the top, is pushed up to the top. On the other hand, it's a problematic thing because this topocentric design squashes or flattens the logical hierarchy, which I'll show in just a bit. I'll digress a little bit. In 1965, the STOP report was published by three working technical editors, and they propounded a document format called STOP, which was actually quite popular for about 20 years. And STOP is topocentric in the same way that PowerPoint is. The way STOP works, you have a slide title. You also have these little headers, and you're going to have two levels of headers. Then you have a little summary of the body of the slide, not slide, page. And then you have a two-page module, and all the content has to fit in these two-page modules. So what we have here, if you think about the text, the body text of the module as being something like the speaker's gloss in PowerPoint, this is almost like PowerPoint in print. It is topocentric in that same way. And in the STOP format, the hierarchy is shown here because the STOP designers realized that the titles of each module are always going to be pushed up to the top level. Is that clear what I'm saying? That this is kind of a print analog to the problem that we see in PowerPoint. Yes?
So this is very cool. This is really PowerPoint format before PowerPoint.
That's right.
One of the things here is that this display is 2 pages en face, right? Two thick open pages.
That's right.
Really basically like 1 page.
That's right.
With 2 columns.
Well, no. This is 2 pages.
Paper pages.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. It would be possible to set up a format like this in PowerPoint even.
Oh.
With 2 columns.
Mm-hmm.
If that were a better way for people to track information. It seems like the information density is higher too.
Right. Although I'm not suggesting a 2-column PowerPoint, but that's an interesting idea. The whole STOP report is a very, very brilliant and interesting document, and even though it has nothing to do with PowerPoint directly, it sheds a lot of light on these issues. I want to say one thing about print. PowerPoint has this upward vector. There's a little hidden secret of print. The downward vector of print comes about because hierarchies serve the purpose of containment, of nesting. And in a print document, when you have first level headings, second level headings, third level headings, those headings are nesting your ideas from general to specific. But as you're getting to the key ideas, you're also moving visually down the hierarchy. So in a lot of print documents, the most important thing you're saying is at the third level. And in print, oftentimes you're being pushed down and you're fighting to come up. And in PowerPoint, you're usually being pushed up and you're fighting to come down. And that's the sort of key difference between PowerPoint and print. So this then is the PowerPoint distortion hypothesis, the problematic aspect of PowerPoint. And then we have to ask the question, what's the implication for audiences? How does that affect how audiences process information? Yes?
Can you just clarify what you meant by PowerPoint things are pushed up and they're fighting to get down?
Can I show it to you in just one moment? Okay. And then in the case of presenters, just as PowerPoint potentially causes information processing problems for audiences, there's the issue of how it affects the thinking of a deck author as that person is actually creating the deck and organizing his or her ideas. And I'm going to suggest that there are three kinds of distortion. The flattening that I've been talking about, the self-editing of content, and actual changes in the author's conceptualizing of the subject matter. And now it's time to actually show what I'm talking about, okay? So here is a typical deck. It's a fairly substantive genre. I've changed it a little bit, but not a whole lot, just to make things a little bit clearer. So this first slide is a regular previewing slide that we see very typically. And so there are three principles of ethics in human subjects. And so we get to the next slide, and the principle of respect has moved up to the top level, which would be the case in print. But notice here we're talking about the subtopic here is informed consent. In print, informed consent would be at level 2, wouldn't it? But at PowerPoint, it's been pushed up to level 1. So that's the point I was trying to make. Now, once we're talking about informed, well, let me show you this. Look at this alternative version of the slide. What's happening here? This is the PowerPoint author trying to push it down, realizing that informed consent is at the same level of respect, and using the colon, what I call a compound heading, it's an attempt to visually drop it one level lower in the visual hierarchy so it reflects the logical hierarchy more accurately. Then, below informed consent, there are types of informed consent, and there are also basic rules of informed consent. And now we're moving up to the top level, and one more concept at the top level. And when all this is done, this is the actual logical hierarchy. This is what the presenter had in his or her mind when he or she created the deck. And just one second, and this is what we have on the slide. Yes?
Very, very interesting points. I'm just thinking, as we're making this assumption that every subject matter is a true hierarchy, right? That's an interesting. I'm just
Okay.
just to point that out, right? I'm wondering what happened. I mean, everybody in the room, I guess, we all write text documents, and then when time has come, then we make a PowerPoint deck. I assume in many cases that's the way it goes. But I'm wondering what happened if somebody just created a presentation in PowerPoint from scratch. Then you wouldn't have, I don't know. Is there any subject matter that's not inherently a hierarchy?
Human beings think and process information hierarchically most of the time. So once you give a talk or once you're presenting ideas in a non-hierarchical way, I think you're in dangerous territory. Now, of course, it has to do with genre, and fiction or personal thoughts might be different. But I would say that the professional world pretty much depends on people's ability to think hierarchically and convey hierarchical meaning.
Did you ever use or see a presentation of Pan++? That's a zoomable tool where you can lay things out in like 3 space and do really wacky things. And I mean, that was one of the problems of Pan++ was that it did not follow any of these rules, and accordingly, half the audience was completely sucked into it and was just spellbound, and the other half would just completely phase out. Might be an interesting thing to study in that context.
Sure. Let me make another point, which is oftentimes audiences are quite capable of figuring out for themselves what the hierarchical relationships are. In light genres, it's not going to be an issue because you don't need the visual cues. But in substantive genres, it in fact can very well be an issue. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if a significant number of people who went through that deck that I just showed you came out with the impression that there were 4 principles of ethics having to do with human subjects: respect, informed consent, beneficence, and justice. Yes.
So I guess just pushing back a tiny bit, don't you have the same problem in print in that if you're reading a very, very, very long technical argument, you're halfway through one of these and you've lost the context of where it falls in the hierarchy. So I would contend that authors of print do similar tricks of your colon to say, like on pages they'll use footnotes, or not footnotes, but footers to say, okay, this is the subheading I'm currently under, and so forth.
Well, headers are a technique in print to maintain situation awareness, but print still has the heading levels. When you are deep in a long print document and you see a 3rd level heading, and then you turn the page and there's a 2nd level heading, you know you're moving up.
Assuming an author is good enough to actually use
Yes.
this.
That's totally true. Right?
When you say, though, that all of this content is by the way we think about it, hierarchical, aren't you falling into the same trap, though, that Tufte does by framing this all in the context of a very technical type presentation? Because I've seen many, many PowerPoint presentations that were beautifully done, that were completely linear. Okay? There was no hierarchical structure associated with them. They were a telling of a story. Okay? And the story, in many cases, was content-rich. It wasn't fiction. When I say story, I'm using it more broadly than that.
Okay.
But you would be hard-pressed to see it in a hierarchical structure unless you wanted to really, push the issue. And I wonder, I'm coming back to this issue of, is everything necessarily hierarchical? I guess I'm not sold on.
Well, let's get back to the question of genre. So there are many, many genres, okay? And finally, well, first of all, I'm explicit about this being an issue of substantive genres rather than light genres, and probably workplace genres. And I think the mediational problem of PowerPoint tends to be more significant when you have a substantive genre where the audience is being challenged to some degree by the conceptual difficulty or unfamiliarity of the material. As far as narratives, and I know you don't mean fiction, sure, there are things that we do that are not hierarchical. And if you want to have a completely, let's say you have something that is just a complete flat narrative where you don't have main points and subpoints, PowerPoint could be fun. All this may not apply to that. So I am happy to restrict what I'm talking about to that part of the world that depends on making distinctions among main ideas and subordinate ideas, because that is a huge, important part of the world, although the part of the world you're talking about, I'm sure, is very important as well. Okay, so at least for now, that's kind of how I would respond to that. Now I want to turn to a different part of this distortion argument that I'm making, which is again tied to the limited amount of slide space. And I'll also comment that deck authors tend to be nervous about having a very bare slide with, say, one bullet point at the top of a slide. People don't like to do that for reasons that I could get into, but I won't right at the moment. And what happens, I think, is that people will edit their decks to fit the space. How many people here have edited out a bullet point to fit a slide? Okay. Now, you can do that in a good way or a bad way. Maybe you had an unnecessary bullet point. Maybe you just did a nice job of making your ideas more terse. But it's risky territory when the PowerPoint slide is wagging, the tail of PowerPoint is wagging the content dog. Yes?
I guess this objection must be getting old to you, but when I was in 5th grade and learning how to write an outline, our teacher said you must have, at least 2 subpoints below each point in your outline or it's not worth making.
Okay.
When I write technical papers, I want to make 3 points and I'm like, gosh, point number 2, pretty much this backup on is going to be, this stands to reason, while point number 3 is going to take 3 pages of explanation. And so I'll rejigger my content to try and make sense of that. This is a problem for every genre of communication, including Tufte.
I don't think it should be driven by real estate considerations. There's lots to be said. First of all, I don't agree that one heading can only have one subpoint. I think that's one of those old bugbears that I don't buy, but that's a different issue. My point is that when people start editing their slides to fit space, they may be doing good things and they may be doing bad things, but it's uncomfortable territory to be in. And in traditional print documents or in a scrolling document where you don't have the strong slide boundary, you don't have that problem. Okay. Or a different version of the problem. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I wonder about comparing this to print, because typically in PowerPoint, what I'm thinking about it is it's not, it's sort of a side channel in some sense, right? I've heard of speakers who just get up with some index cards and give very good presentations, right? And so really you want to consider I know you want to somehow get it seems like you want to get the audio channel out of here, but to me the audio channel is primary and this is secondary. So like when I work with people in my group and I get rid of text on their slides, we edit it down because it's just sort of the high level ideas and what they're saying is the important thing. Right. So I just wonder sort of about. I mean, I understand it's important to sort of look at the PowerPoint as an artifact and criticize it, but without the context of the audio channel, which I think is really primary. The
audio speaker can make the logical distinctions.
They can do all sorts of things to bring flow where there isn't flow, to introduce hierarchy where there isn't hierarchy. I mean, there's so much that goes on in that channel.
Totally true, and yet why have a medium where the visual dimension is working against you and not for you? Mm-hmm. And I think I'd like to move forward because I want to finish going through the slides, then we can do questions after that. Here's just a case in point of just 2 totally random slides where the author has somehow made everything fit, and you just wonder what has been left off, what has been changed. The auto-fit feature is a very strange way of making things fit, because you can make anything fit, but it keeps dropping the size of your font. So that's a problematic solution. And then one more example of the problem, and this is a different kind of example, because here what I'm trying to do is get into the head of a deck author. Now, in the previous two examples, the deck author had a very clear idea of his or her own hierarchy, of the logical relationships among the ideas. Now we're talking about someone who, let us say, is more casual, or let us say is creating the deck, is creating the presentation in PowerPoint and not taking a pre-existing set of ideas and PowerPointing them. Is that distinction clear? Because there are two ways we use PowerPoint. We think our ideas through in PowerPoint, or we start with ideas and sort of port them into PowerPoint. So let's say you have a real estate agent, and the real estate agent is making a deck, problems acting as your own agent. So here's problem A and problem B, and then selling may take a little longer. See, it's not fitting? Now, one thing the real estate agent might do is this, which is fine. So now we have the repeated title slide, and selling may take longer becomes the third point. But what about this? The other possibility is for that third point to be promoted to become a title slide. It is now independent. It is no longer one of the problems acting as your own agent. It's kind of a general statement about selling your house. So undisciplined thinkers are going to be, let us say, ruled by PowerPoint more than keeping control of PowerPoint, and you can actually have a situation where people's ideas are being changed by the fact that they're thinking their ideas through while authoring a deck. I'll give one more example of that. What happens when you have a bullet point and a graphic that logically fits under the bullet point? That's difficult, isn't it? Oftentimes there's no room for the graphic, right? How many people have taken that bullet point, turned it into a title slide, which now gives you a new blank space to put the graphic? Okay? So what's happened now? That idea, which was a bullet point, which was a sub to a title slide, is now coordinate with the title slide. Is that harmful? Who knows? Maybe the audience can figure it out. Maybe the distinction isn't that important. Maybe you can orally make the logical relationship clear. But my point is still that PowerPoint has had a significant mediational effect, and that mediational effect goes in the direction, when it's not under control, of altering, in this case, altering how people either express themselves, or in this case, even how people think. So there is, I think, a real issue here that's significant. And now, what, in fact, can we possibly do about this? And I have three sort of directions to suggest. And I don't think I'm going to hit a bullseye as a designer of the PowerPoint app. These are just broad ideas. And here's the one that interests me the most. A scrollable slide area that the speaker can actually, in a certain sense, open up extra amounts of screen real estate when he or she needs to fit that extra bullet point and so forth. This is an old HLP file, help file. And you can see that you have the non-scrolling area here, which could be where the title slide would be. And then you can scroll extra space here and and have as much room as you need. I don't think PowerPoint should be primarily a scrolling application, but that extra freedom, I think, could be pretty useful. Another possibility is to encourage section slides. Section slides give you a higher level of the hierarchy. Since PowerPoint is squashing, section slides give you one more level. and yet the default slide layouts in PowerPoint do not have a section layout. There's a title layout. The simplest change would be to make a section layout to encourage people to have one more level in the hierarchy. Another possibility would be to either implement in some way or at least encourage, through encouraging good practices, 2 levels of slide text, 2 levels of headings in the slide titles. And the third direction is to try to have a means of displaying the hierarchy that is separate and removed from the actual main content area of the slide. So when you put a PowerPoint slide on the web, you get that navigation column on the left, but it's totally flat. There might be a means in which that navigation column could show distinctions between the logical levels of the slide titles and the section slides. And then one more idea, and presenters do this all the time, but PowerPoint doesn't encourage it, would be some kind of a header feature that would encourage presenters to do something like this, where you're seeing that audience analysis is in the broader category of approach. And then finally, directions for further research. And I think when we deal with PowerPoint, we need to be thinking more about structure. Obviously, when someone says directions for further research, it's always what they do, right? So this is what I do. But I think we have a lot of emphasis on the graphical part of PowerPoint, on the attractiveness part of PowerPoint, and we're not doing as much to support substantive presentations where making logical distinctions is important. And I think we need to know more about how the mediational effect of PowerPoint affects the way in which audiences process information. And I think we need to study the composing process, the authoring process of deck authors. Let people make decks and have them vocalize what they're doing as they create the deck and try to understand that process better. And then finally, and this is my very last point, we don't have a vocabulary to talk about deck content. We can talk about bullet points or subpoints and title slides. It's much more subtle and much more complicated than that. And we don't have a vocabulary to make even the most rudimentary distinctions about the different ways in which speakers actually interact with their decks. And with that, I close, and I'd like to go back to questions. Yes? Thank you. Yeah.
You were talking about how important it is that the slide is a resource for the speaker, that it's really the speaker's gloss. I don't think that's happening in practice, and I think it's the design of PowerPoint that is causing that not to happen. And while you were speaking, I observed this in your own talk, in fact. There are only 3 occasions in the entire talk where you engaged us, the audience, for longer than 10 seconds. All of the time, you were going back to refer to the slide that was on the screen. And indeed, for all but 2 of the slides, you were following through exactly what the slide said in the order that the slide said. And I think that shows that the slides were not being a resource. They were controlling, in fact, the way you were presenting it, apart from these 3 occasions.
Possibly, I should have given a total free-form presentation. No, I'm taking your statement very seriously. There are people who would just talk and just have the PowerPoint as graphics. I could just begin and present my ideas, and at the right moment, just show this example or that example. I think my material is a little bit too difficult for that, or maybe I'm not a sufficiently skilled speaker. I'd be a little nervous just coming right up and just talking without the structure. But yes, PowerPoint is both a way of communicating with the audience and a way for the speaker to stay on track. And if you're saying that speakers should be able to do without that, maybe so. In the real professional world, there would not be too many speakers who would want to do that and not too many speakers who would succeed at that. So my point would that would be for a very talented speaker. Yes?
So many people I see over a long period of time, they go through some sort of evolution, and I think many of us can just, when we look at our own slide decks from a couple of years ago, they're more terrible than the ones, we feel pretty good about our current slide decks, and we look back and, in a couple of years ago, we'll feel really bad about the ones that we're using today. One of the really good ones I've seen was we had Ben Shed here, who did IMAX, he comes from cinematography, and he made this wonderful presentation that basically had no text whatsoever and was just a walk through different things, just took us on a tour and talked to it. I really like that. I think an interesting question as a kind of a research question could be, is there any way, obviously everybody who might visit PowerPoint for the first time makes a really terrible deck. Is there a way to kind of support personal kind of growth in that space? Is there a way how we can create an affordance into the tool that makes people more like Ben Shed, maybe faster than they normally would, and prevents people from just getting stuck in a certain kind of mode? It's just a high-level question.
I think there's a huge amount we can do in terms of training and best practices, because PowerPoint is used terribly, and you can try to do everything we can do with the tool, but you still, let it loose in the world, and people are going to do what they're going to do, and the issue of communication skills is a huge one.
Yeah, I would say to that, it's the same thing is true. If I look back at my writing from 10 years ago, it's terrible. And I'm sure,
Right.
I think that's just true for just communication in general, skill.
But there are obviously sufficient people who haven't gotten better that they're still making terrible decks that drive everyone crazy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes. Well, can I ask someone who hasn't been able to ask a question yet? Yes.
So I'm not sure if this was keynote or not, but I saw this one slide
presentation where it was some kind of zoomable presentation. So they had a large picture of a microprocessor, and they would actually zoom in, and there would be an animation where they'd zoom in on a portion of the microprocessor, and they did like 5 or 6 slides that were just zooms of that one slide. Is that something you've seen?
I haven't seen it. I can imagine it.
I've also seen it where they'll
actually scroll into the other slide. Instead of it being like just a hard transition, somehow it would just smoothly go to the other slide.
That really interests me because that's in the direction of that scrolling, loosening,
it was just a scrolling,
softening that hard display unit boundary. Seems to me a promising direction, yes.
And I've also seen people put keys on their slide. So that it's like basically a thumbnail of the outline. And then as you're going through the slide, you can see where you are in the outline. And that gives you
That's, in my way of thinking, that's the idea of putting the hierarchy outside the slide. And I'm sure there are lots of ways of doing it. I'm not really trying to say this is precisely the way PowerPoint might be redesigned. I'm more trying to make the point that the whole approach that I'm talking about, the focus on the way in which PowerPoint mediates structure is an important issue. And if people are willing to accept that premise, then there could be lots and lots of design ideas, and I certainly don't have the true answer about how that would be done. Yes?
I think one thing that you should, I don't know if you've looked at this, but a lot of people use PowerPoint not for oral presentations at all. Like I worked in many situations as a consultant where you do a 3-month project, with a large team, maybe 10 people. Your end result is a fairly lengthy, maybe 70 or 80 page PowerPoint presentation, but it's somewhat dense, but it isn't necessarily. And that is the final artifact. And there may be a meeting where it's presented, where everyone has a printed copy and we talk about it. But that ends up being an artifact that's filed away and used by other people in the future. And there, hierarchy becomes extremely important.
More important. That's right. When
Why do you, in that context, though, use PowerPoint rather than
it's a very standard. If you go to McKinsey, it's a very standard practice, right? And the reason why is that typically you're presenting the end artifact to very senior level executives, which will never read a full document at all. yet they want a discussion, right? So it just ends up being, in some ways, you're using the constraints of this very discrete page-based process and the finite amount of space to actually constrain the amount of material to a digestible amount for these people.
The pitch books, they're mostly printed, not projected.
Right, you're never projected. And then
Well, they go up on the web, they go everywhere. I call that standalone PowerPoint where there's no presenter.
It's
extremely popular. And there, the problems I'm talking about become that much more acute because you don't have the presenter to sort out the ideas. Yes?
But that means that when you're attacking Tufte for neglecting the presenter,
Yeah.
a huge chunk of the PowerPoint in the world, even if it was presented at some point or another, the words "send me the deck" appear in basically 1/3 of all the email that I have.
Okay. Yes.
And everyone because their email looks the same way.
That's a completely separate dimension to the problem. So really, I would say that PowerPoint in support of a presentation and standalone PowerPoint are like two separate media altogether. And yes, that's a whole... Yes, but why? Excuse me? Because one has the speaker's oral gloss and one doesn't. But I think we're all in total agreement here. That just is one more, that sort of exacerbates the problem. By the way, since we're talking about that, you know the notes panel, the notes pane? That's become a medium. People are now, my wife, who's a technical editor, had a project where the deliverable consisted of the slides elaborated on with the text in the notes pane. So you have a totally unintended communication medium with all problems, of its own. So yes, the whole issue of standalone PowerPoint is
some tool in between Word and PowerPoint or some slide scales. I don't know.
So why is that an unintended
consequence
of the we intended people to type supporting material so that they wouldn't load up their slides and that they would, and of course later we'll be able to show it to them in presenter view.
Oh, okay. Then excuse me. By notes pane, I took it to mean the speaker's notes, the private.
Yeah, it's essentially the commentary. One of the things that's becoming popular with like Cliff Atkinson's and stuff like that is to load up all the text that the speaker would actually say, or their speaking bullets that are more elaborate, and then have just a visual there, and then send out the notes page as print out of the notes pages as a PDF or something. So that they're looking at the slide that was there, plus seeing the text of what the speaker said, basically.
Right.
Which is becoming sort of a much more popular way of making the deck portable, so if you weren't at the speech, you actually get what amounts to a crystallization of the speech.
The problem with that is that you don't have a gestural way of taking something in the notes pane and making it clear to what bullet point you're referring. So that's the weakness there, I think.
You have to architect it that way. You have to put that bullet point into the text, maybe bold it or do something to identify it.
Right.
Other questions? Kind of a follow-up to what Howard was saying. The movement among presentation cognoscenti is to move away from bullet points, which I think you've got a pretty rational reaction. I think a lot of people still will continue to use bullet points as their major point of view because it's harder to turn it into graphic thought. We're doing a lot of that in 12. But if you look at like Saul Werman in Information Anxiety, he talks about information density in space, and you really want to break that open, but it doesn't get away from the idea that you constructed the hierarchy before you constructed the slide or the message, and then you could move it into whatever you're doing to convey it to the audience, whether it's a picture of a flower and all your notes, or it's all the text on the slide that is easily determined what level of hierarchy, wherever you are. Since
Cliff Atkinson's book has come into the conversation, and it's pretty relevant, I think that is a destructive book. I think it's a terrible book. I think that's truly one of the worst things that's been written about PowerPoint. And my reason is that bullet points serve a purpose of conveying key information visually, which is elaborated upon by the speaker. Now, in a light genre, a welcome to this conference or something like that, you don't need the bullet points. Sure, there are times when we don't need PowerPoint at all. But by eliminating, by just banning bullet points the way he does, and Atkinson doesn't restrict himself to light genres. If Atkinson said, very often you don't need bullet points, very often all you need is some graphics and maybe in the slide titles, but Atkinson is making the case that there's this universal method for making decks and that bullet points don't figure into that. And I've had people come to me in 2 cases saying, my boss or a high-level client wants a deck Cliff Atkinson style. And I can't figure out how to make an effective deck taking out the bullet points. And I say to the person, your boss, if it's a substantive presentation, you don't want a bullet pointless deck because the bullet points are there for a purpose. So Atkinson, at best, is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Just because people are misusing bullet points, and he complains about overly long bullet points, and he says that speakers don't look at the audience, they read their bullet points verbatim, and there are loads of things we can say about the misuse of PowerPoint. But the solution to just flat out say no more bullet points is a terrible direction, I would say.
And I've heard Cliff speak and Joe's book, but the main thing I think is that people's cognitive processing is interrupted when they're seeing the same information visually that they're hearing through their audio channel. And he has some research on this. I haven't read the research on that, but his idea is that you're showing them something that's evocative, maybe affecting them more creatively, and you're giving them the more logical information while you talk about it. And that if they need to see something more detailed than that, then that's in the handout. The bullet points are in the handout. So it's more the art of public speaking with supporting visuals rather than showing them something and talking about what you're showing them. And he says that confuses people's processing.
The scholar, the central scholar here is Richard Mayer, who's, I believe, the most published psychologist that there in modern times. And he's a scholar of multimedia. And Mayer talks about split attention and the problems when you're listening to something and reading something and the split attention problem. Now, if you have terse bullet points that the audience can read in a split second, or if the presenter reads them, it's in a split second, and then the presenter is elaborating on the bullet points, there is no conflict between the bullet points and what the presenter is saying. The bullet points become a reminder or a reference. The problem that Atkinson is talking about, and Atkinson seriously misuses Mayer's research, is, okay, sure, if I have a big, long 3-line bullet point and I read it verbatim, that's tedious. But if I say something completely different, then you as the audience have the dilemma of, do I read the bullet point or do I listen to me speaking? That's the split attention problem that Mayer was talking about. But if I have 4 relatively short bullet points, that shouldn't be a problem. Yes?
If you've got 4 short bullet points, though, you're only talking about one of them at a time. And while you're talking about one of them, I might be reading the other 2-word bullet point and wondering what that one's all about.
Mm-hmm.
So I can easily see how that can still split my attention to have bullet points. Because there's like these
Sure.
distinct ideas that you're putting all next to each other. One of them talking about one.
My response to that is I actually would be perfectly happy, probably every time I put up a slide, everyone saw all the bullet points first. Because, I mean, and I think that's perfectly okay. I'm perfectly willing to have you look at all my bullet points first. It empowers the audience. Because it doesn't take that much time. You can read a few bullet points in just 10 or 15 seconds. If you want to stop that, you can use progressive revelation, where you show the first bullet point and you don't show the next one, and then you add to it.
What's the value that's added by having these multiple disjoint ideas on the screen at the same time?
But they say good reading is you go to the end of the chapter and read the conclusion, read the questions, and then read the
Well, right, but then he can show the conclusion and then hide it while he shows
I don't think they're disjoint. I think you benefit, if I'm making 3 points about something, right? Personally, I think it is better for everybody in the audience, assuming that the bullet points are reasonably short and reasonably revealing, reasonably meaningful, you are empowered by immediately seeing my 3 points, listening to me talk about the first one, listening to me talk about the second, and listening to me talk about the third. I don't think that's a problem. If you think it's a problem, you can use progressive revelation, show the first one, prevent the audience from straying, from looking at the second one. You know, it's an empowerment issue. On one hand, you get better focus because the audience doesn't have the option of looking at those second bullet points. On the other hand, they don't have the empowerment of seeing where the whole argument is going. Let's have a little poll and tell me how we're going to break this up. How many people prefer progressive revelation when you're shown the first bullet point but not the next ones, and each one? And how many people would just as soon see the whole bunch together? As an audience. How many people as an audience prefer progressive revelation? How many people want to see them all? Okay.
It totally depends on the context.
Okay, it depends. Yes, but it's interesting that a significant number of people were willing to say, don't hide things from me. I'm willing to take my chance about being distracted. I want to see the whole argument. Yes?
Back to what you're saying at the very beginning about we're a very homogenous audience, and it really depends on who you're presenting to,
Sure.
their characteristics, and what they can absorb.
Yes, and I'm not totally against progressive revelation. I'm only talking about the issue here. In different times, progressive revelation would make sense.
Into this, but then getting back to the whole, do you need to show the bullet points at all, or do you do it in some other format?
I mean, if you're shaping the presentation in the sense that you can see there's a heading and there's a bullet point and there's going to be more bullet points, I kind of want to know what follows after that, because now you've told me, oh, there's going to be more things and I want to know what they are. But if you're doing a Lessig-style presentation where each slide is a word, I'm not thinking, I wonder what the next word is going to be. Show me the next words. I mean, it's a totally different kind of approach.
There are many cases where you don't want to use PowerPoint at all. You know, if the slide bullet point layout doesn't fit what you're trying to do, just don't turn on PowerPoint. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think that these can't be divorced from the quality of the speaker. That the average number of presentations I see are bad, and on the average time, I'd rather see all the bullet points so I can stop paying attention.
That's right.
Because I don't want to have to wait, and
That's
I want
right.
to do whatever I'm doing on my computer. And so these details are like very speaker dependent, and we're talking now about giving good presentations, and there are lots of ways to give good presentations if you have handouts to give or if you have good graphics to display. But I think that your points are valid on the average that most people use the default presentation, have flat hierarchies, and are modifying their content to fit some standard procedure. But I don't think that I think that there's still room to improve, like you said.
Okay.
We're getting caught up in like some very sticky details that I don't see the point.
And talking about Lessig, I think that's Lawrence Lessig. Yeah. He probably runs around the country giving the same talk.
No, it's different every time.
Okay.
I'll tell you that flat out. I've seen him talk multiple times.
But he's also
every time.
There are dog and pony show presentations, and that's not I don't mean that in a negative way. We're, again, talking about the presenter and the performance. If you're a presenter and you mentally know what's on every slide coming up, and you just know that presentation intimately, you're in a totally different place than the typical corporate presenter who maybe isn't as brilliant as Lawrence Lessig, but more to the point, isn't giving the same presentation over and over and over again, which gets back to this broad issue of the differences in performance and performer skills. Yes, sir.
So I want to bring up just another point, and maybe this is a little off topic, but the pen I found really liberating for PowerPoint, and I don't know if you've investigated that. So what I find in PowerPoint is because of the formalism of text and drawing ovals using the draw tool, you spend this time making something that looks formal and nice. And if you want to just sketch some ideas, if you've got a pen in your hand, I find now what I do in PowerPoint is I just put some ideas out, I draw some figures, it looks like a mess, but I know I'm going to clean it up later. And I think the authoring process is really sort of weird with PowerPoint being, you get into this very formal mode where a lot of times what you want to do is just a sketch, right? And so I think it would be interesting, probably we're looking at that somewhat, but already, but I think, the pen can really help sort of free you up in the authoring process.
Sure. That's a fascinating idea. Doesn't PowerPoint really brings out a lot of energy in people? Yes.
So what you were saying about how if you're not a really strong presentation, you might not be able to do the Lessig style or whatever.
That's right.
But to me, I think it's wrong to look at your PowerPoint slides as a visual aid to yourself to help you remind. If you need notes, then write them for yourself. But
yes and no. PowerPoint slides should not be your notes. You should not put something up just because it's a convenient speaker note. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that let's imagine a speaker who never looked at the deck, just kept his or her face completely away from the deck and made no use of the fact that there are slides and bullet points. That speaker is going to have a lot of mastery of the content. I think it's a middle.
Your own notes that tell you what your slides have and remind you to say things. You don't need to show those reminders to everyone. That just seems like the wrong thing to do.
You can actually do that in PowerPoint with the presenter too. You can type in your notes and see them on your laptop while you're projecting your
with two monitors.
So you want to click through on something
Sure.
I do that all the time, but it's broken in some fundamental ways too.
No, I totally agree. Particularly if you can do it inconspicuously in some way, or if you don't have too many notes. There's lots to be said for having totally private information. I'm only saying that there's no reason why we have to be so extreme as to say that the speaker should get no benefit from seeing what the content of the slide is. You don't make slides that are just your notes on the screen, right? That's one extreme. But to simply say that the slide content has no effect on the speaker during the performance is another extreme. I'll just ask people, when you give a talk, don't you make some use of the fact that there's text on the slide? Isn't it the starting point for what you say about each side?
I feel guilty about it.
So you could give a talk and just have the remote and advance your deck and never look behind you?
Yeah, I mean, the talks I give, I'm really passionate and interested about. Engages the audience.
Okay, I'm impressed.
There's one other place where you often use this, the text in the slideshow, is whenever you're actually needing to interact, direct the audience's attention to specific pieces. You know, whether you're using a laser pointer or something like that, where you're saying, I want you to pay attention to this piece right here. And I think that that's actually really valuable as well, because it's like, this bullet point, it may look like all the other bullet points, but boy, you need to pay attention to this one, or whatever. I mean, it seems to me that that's actually another place where it's actually really useful for the speaker to engage the audience.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I often see really great presentations with PowerPoint with a good animation.
Okay.
So I was wondering, you haven't talked about that. Is that a technique that may overcome some of the problems that you encounter?
I don't know that it would. An animation to me is in the nature of a graphic. So you show the animation and then you talk about it in some context. So the problems that I'm talking about probably are not remediated specifically with animations. I think I agree with you. Animations can be great and you can show wonderful things with animations. But what I've been talking about today is the mediational issue and how PowerPoint affects logical relationships. And I don't quite see how the use of animation figures directly into that issue.
You're all so engaged on the topic. I think maybe we should end it formally here, and then if people have more questions, you can come up and talk to us directly. Okay? Thank you very much.